I don't want to really catalyze PTSD in you, but can you discuss the cases where you had a false positive? In other words, that you thought someone was a pattern breaker, but after all, didn't.
Oh, sure. In fact, it's most of the time. So, Warren Buffett, I've heard him say, rule number one, don't lose money. Rule number two, don't forget rule number one. For me, rule number one is don't pass on Airbnb. So if I'd been wrong about Airbnb, I could only lose 100% my money. But if you're right, you can sometimes make 1,000 times or more. I don't look at risk as the chance of success or failure. I think of risk through an expected value lens. I'm like, okay, in the 20% case, it's right. How big does it need to be a good expected value bet, even though it's risky?
Hello, I'm Guy Kawasaki. This is the Remarkable People podcast, and we're in the business of helping you become remarkable. So we scour the globe for the most remarkable people, and we found a remarkable person named Mike Maples Jr. And in the prelude, we were just discussing, he and I go far back because in college, he read my books, which is kind of a disturbing thing when people tell you that they read your book in college and now they're way out of college. But anyway, so he is a venture capitalist today. He's the co-founder of a leading Silicon Valley seed fund called the Floodgate. And he has invested in companies like Twitter and Twitch and Okta. He's really one of the pioneers of seed capital in the mid-2000s. So with no further ado, Mike Maples Jr., welcome to Remarkable People.
Hey, well, thanks, Guy. And I've been looking forward to this. I think I've probably known you much longer than you've known me because I got to know you somewhat through your books, when I was in college.
Wow. Well, I mean, like I said, that's kind of a double-edged sword. Well, as long as you don't think that I wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad, I call that a win. So I'm easy to please that way, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the ones I really remember in my formative years were The Macintosh Way. The other one was Selling the Dream. And I think in Selling the Dream, I was actually at Kepler's bookstore when you launched it. I probably have a signed copy. And one of the aspects of it I remember is I think it had the Macintosh product introduction plan in it.
Yes, in the back.
So at the time, I was a young product manager at Silicon Graphics. And, you didn't really get trained in marketing back in those days. And so everything I knew about marketing was just what I read in marketing books. And so that was an actual introduction plan. I was like, hey, man, I could really learn something from this. And then reading your books kind of led me to Regis McKenna and some of his work. I always thought that he had some really good ideas around like relationship marketing and, how do you evangelize ideas? So I feel like I've probably known you. Hopefully, I don't seem like a stalker, but I've known you since you were CEO of Acius.
Wow, man, you're going back you're going back so far. I was young, so I loved your book, and I see so much stuff that I agree with in your book. And let's start with something very basic. Your book is all about getting these inflections and getting insights from the inflections and turning it into ideas. So let's start with a definition to help everybody. What exactly do you consider an inflection?
Yeah, so an inflection is a change event that's actually external to a startup or any business for that matter. And it allows a startup capitalist to compete by changing the subject. So what I like to say is that in startups, better doesn't matter because business is never a fair fight. And if you're a startup, you have to have some form of weapons to wage asymmetric warfare on the present. You have to turn the incumbents' greatest perceived strengths into their biggest weaknesses. And the way entrepreneurs do that is they harness inflections. They use inflections to bend the arc of the present to a radically different future. And by doing that, they deny the premise of the rules of competition. They show up seemingly out of left field, and now all of a sudden they disorient the incumbents. It's like Airbnb did this in hospitality, and Twitter did this in blogging and communication. But nobody ever, when they saw Airbnb, said, well, how does that compare to Four Seasons? And nobody, when they saw Twitter, said, how does that compare to WordPress? It stood alone as an entirely new thing. And so, I like to say better doesn't matter when you're startup, because if you're better, then the customer is going to have an alternative to your startup. And why would they pick your product when you're 80% likely to go out of business? They're only going to pick your product if it can't be reconciled with anything they've ever seen before. And if they say, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? And so the way that the founder achieves that goal is they harness inflections. They use the power of inflections to offer something that would seem unthinkable before the inflection happened.
But Mike,
Yes.
Do inflections cause companies to succeed, or do companies cause inflections to succeed? Which way does it flow?
Yeah, so I like that question, and it is one of these kind of recursively existential questions too, right? The way I internalized it was, what should founders care about? And what I thought was, okay, founders need some type of a power to change the subject. And so when I think about an inflection, whether the founder caused it or leveraged it, what matters, I think, from the founder point of view is three things. One is just, what is the specific empowerment? Does it offer something that can provide a 10x benefit, or something radically unique that's never been seen before? Or is it just kind of an API call that got added to Stripe's API list, right? So the good example of an inflection would have been, that was empowering, was the iPhone 4S had a GPS chip in it. And you could have had the idea for ride sharing before the iPhone 4S, but it wouldn't have mattered because you couldn't have implemented a system that embodied that idea. But now all of a sudden you have a GPS chip in the phone. You can locate riders and drivers with an algorithm. So that's an example of something very empowering. The second thing we want to see in an inflection is, who does it empower? Who cares? And so, in the case of the iPhone 4S, a lot of people care because a lot of people have smartphones. And so the potential surface area of the empowerment is very high, because if you believe that smartphones will keep happening and they'll keep having GPS chips in them, then potentially that's hundreds of millions, if not billions of people someday. And then the third aspect of the inflection is, I call it the empowerment conditions. And so we've had nuclear power since the 40s, but we haven't built a nuclear power plant in the United States since the 1970s. And so just because you have a power doesn't mean you're going to use it or be allowed to use it. And there might be political factors, there might be trust factors, there could be a lot of reasons that people don't decide to adopt it. So those are the three things I look for. How, what's the magnitude of the empowerment? Who does it empower? And under what conditions will people decide to take advantage of it? And under what conditions will they decide not to? And if you can get all three of those things going your way as a founder, now you have, it's kind of like a Rock and David slingshot against Goliath, right? Now you have something that you can bring to the party that changes the subject.
Well, when I read your book and I read that concept, I thought to myself, oh my God, this is such a high fence. I mean, in a sense, you're saying that every successful startup either caused or, significantly jumped on an inflection. And I got to tell you, I see a lot of startups that I would hardly affiliate them with truly an inflection. So
Yeah.
are you that tough? I mean, if somebody shows up at Floodgate and they just have something better, do you just throw them out the door?
Well, I don't throw them out the door. I wish them well, right? But what I say to them is like, look, do you want to pursue an idea that has outlier, unbounded upside potential or not? And if you're not harnessing an inflection in your startup idea, you're competing in somebody else's sandbox. The mistake most startups make is they say, I want to go after a big market. And that makes sense on the surface because big markets have lots of customers and revenue. But the problem is that the founder often unwittingly buys into a context, which is the market as it's defined as the market. And if the market's already defined, then somebody's defined it. And that person has the advantage over you because they get to define the discussion that occurs and they already have the advantages of the incumbency. And so therefore, It's kind of like if you're competing over territory that's a tiny little municipality in an already discovered city. You're not going to have as big of an upside as if you're Lewis and Clark mapping the Louisiana Purchase territory and discovering the undiscovered land. And so I'm not interested in the total existing or total available market. I'm interested in the total future market. I'm interested in a product that defines a future market because it harnesses these inflections. And so I just say to a founder, hey, look, I'm not for everybody, but that's what I'm in it for. I'm trying to find startups that harness these inflections in unconventional ways to create a product that radically changes how people think, feel, and act. And to me, that's where the startup wins, is when they do that. So there's two ways to look at the future. Do you believe it's going to be a new and improved version of the present, in which case the incumbents are going to usually win that? Or do you believe that the future's not going to be able to be reconciled with the present, in which case the startup can win? And by the way, you worked for a guy who's the master at this, and he did it even in a big company. So like Steve Jobs, when he comes back to Apple, everybody says, hey, you should license the Mac OS and run it on Intel, and you should have a clone market just like Microsoft and IBM do, and all this stuff. Jobs didn't do that. Jobs always found a way to change the subject. With the iPod, he found this inflection in the sense of a tiny little hard disk that he could put into a music player. And with the iPhone, he waited until the technology was ready, that the touch screen was good enough and that the power in the phone was good enough that he could put Mac OS in a phone device. But Jobs never competed by being better at something. He always competed by showing up with something radically different and helping the rest of us understand what was important about it. And he did that by harnessing inflections. He just naturally knew how to do that because he knew that was his weapon to sort of change the discussion.
So let's talk about what I consider maybe the biggest inflection, certainly in my career, and I might argue in the history of mankind, which is artificial intelligence. And it seems to me that I use ChatGPT, I use Claude, I use Perplexity, I use 4 or 5 LLMs. And for the life of me, I cannot tell you why I use one over the other. Mm-hmm. So if you were to talk to the CEO of Claude or Perplexity and you would tell them, like, listen, you're just doing something better. Maybe your model is better or something, but you are not fundamentally changing. How does Perplexity or Claude compete against Gemini in Google? I mean, I just don't see how they differentiate.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I love this question because it highlights a real challenge, I think, right now, which is, yes, you want an inflection, but you also want to have an insight. And so it's not enough to just have a powerful idea. If a whole bunch of other people have that same powerful idea, then the opportunity gets somewhat competed away. You want to be non-consensus and right. So like if we go back to the example of Lyft, and then we can relate it to AI, I suppose, the iPhone 4S had an inflection in terms of empowering people to locate riders and drivers. But the founders of Lyft and Uber had to have the insight that, that means you could create a transportation network that has network effects. And that's where the creativity of the founder comes in. And now it's obvious. Now people are like, well, ride sharing, of course. But at the time, it seemed kind of crazy. Like, who's going to get in a stranger's car? Yeah. Like that's nobody's going to do that. That's crazy. Just like, who's going to stay in a stranger's house? That's crazy. And so most of the great startups, they have to have an insight, because if human beings are conditioned to like things, and so if everybody likes your idea, it's too similar to what they already know, which means it's too much of an incremental improvement. It's too much competing on better versus different. So the best startup ideas I've seen have this quality of, most people kind of don't like it at first, or don't think like, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? I've seen the light. This is amazing. And so you want that. You want to be non-consensus and right. It's not enough just to be right. You got to be non-consensus and right. So when I think back to Perplexity and Claude and these guys, I don't really think of them as startups in the way that maybe you and I think of startups. Because, sorry, my camera's acting up on me here. The way I think of Perplexity and those guys is, I think of them more as like small versions of big companies. And so if I think about those companies they're not really trying to, in a capital efficient way, create some asymmetrically radically difference. They're partnering with the big tech companies to create scalable technology. And I think it just happens to be that they're right now small versions of big tech companies. But I don't think of Chat GPT and Claude and those guys as like startup capitalists. I think of them as probably someday a large division of a big tech company. We just don't know which one yet.
I mean, in a sense, even though what they do is so exciting, it sounds kind of boring when you put it that way. With all this talk about the, entrepreneurs, the true entrepreneurs who are creating or writing this inflection point, I guess my big question for you, Mike, is how do you separate the nutcases from the pattern breakers? Because at the time you hear some of these pitches, you must think these people are nuts. And then 5 years later, you say, oh, they were so right. So how do you figure that out? Who are the nutcases and who are the breakers?
Yeah, and it's funny, like some books, right, are born of experience and competence and expertise. This book that I wrote started more out of embarrassment, right? I'd passed on Air Bed and Breakfast, which became Airbnb, and I would have made like thousands of times my money if I'd done it. And then I noticed that 80% of my exit profits had come from pivots. So Twitter had started as a podcasting company called Odeo. Twitch had started out as a terrible idea called Justin.tv. And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, what business am I even in here? Am I just throwing darts? Should I just retire before I get exposed, And so so what I started to realize was that these startup ideas that were working, they were harnessing inflections and they were non-consensus and right. Now here's the tricky part, right? And it gets to your question, I think, which is when you're non-consensus and right, you don't know that you're right at first. You only know that you're non-consensus. If you knew you were right, it would be too obvious. And so like the less obvious it is, the less you can know for sure that you're right. So on some level, you have to try the idea. You have to decide, I don't know if I'm 100% right yet, but this is a non-consensus area that's worth pursuing. It's worth my energy and time to figure out. And if I'm not 100% right, I might pivot. So how do you tell the difference? What's the right kind of crazy? What's the wrong kind of crazy? The question I like to ask is this from the future? I think William Gibson, the cyberpunk author, was right when he said the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so, like, for example, when Mark Andreessen worked on the Mosaic browser at the University of Illinois, he was in a supercomputer lab with a really fast network and powerful computers. His idea of what networks were going to be was a better version of the future than Microsoft's top-down or AOL or the U.S. government or AT&T or Time Warner's view of a tops-down network. I think that the way you know that a non-consensus idea is worth pursuing is the authenticity of the founder to that future that they're pursuing. If you're living in the future before other people and you're harnessing powerful inflections before other people, the odds that you're going to build the right thing are much higher to be correct. And so that your intuition about what to build is far more likely to be right. And so that's what I really look for is I want to know, is this founder living in the future for the rest of us? Are they intrinsically motivated by that future? Or are they just pursuing what they think is hot? And do they have insights about what to build because of their authentic obsession with that future? And I believe that causes you to be more likely to build the right thing, but it also makes you more credible to early believers. It causes other people to say, hey, I agree that, this guy Kawasaki guy with this ACES relational database here, I think he's noticed something that others haven't noticed. And, I kind of want to join that movement. And so, and I remember this from when you were a founder. I think in your database at Fourth Dimension, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but your contacts, you would have a tag next to them. And one of the tags was like true believer. And like Joe Lemont, right, my roommate in college, you had tagged him as a true believer. And so that's like these early startup markets are animated by belief, not utility, right? People buy from startups for aesthetic reasons, not practical reasons. And they do it because they co-create the future with the founders. It's the early believers that do that with the founders. And it's the belief in a different but aesthetically superior future that drives people to kind of move the present to a different future together.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm looking for, right? I want the idea that's non-consensus, but I want to believe that the person comes by the idea honestly, that they come by it by authentically pursuing a future that I can get behind.
So today in artificial intelligence, do you have any examples of this non-consensus kind of inflection idea?
Yeah, so I'd say that the AI has been really challenging for me because I see inflections every week, but somebody shows up and says I have this great idea, and I'm like, I would totally use that product, but I don't know why there's not going to be 10 just like it, which means it doesn't have enough of an insight. So I'll give an example of one that I think does. So I'm involved with this company called Applied Intuition, and they make autonomous vehicle simulation software and software-defined platforms for the car companies. And so let's say you're General Motors or Porsche or you're one of these big car companies. Tesla has a software-defined car and you don't really. And you don't really know how to build it. And you don't really know how to, the electric vehicles are more like a software platform architecture versus a supply chain with a bajillion suppliers that you've all done business with for 50 years. And so Kasser Yunus started this company with some friends of his from Google. They'd grown up in Detroit. Kasser had worked at General Motors after graduating from undergrad. Then he went to Silicon Valley, was at Google for a while, worked on the Google Maps team, knew all the guys at Waymo. And so he can go to the CEO of a company like Porsche and say, hey, if you want to have a software-defined car, I'm your only path to getting there. You don't have the internal talent. I have the best developers in the world tackling this problem. And you can only get this talent if you do business with me. And so now is Sam Altman going to release a new version of ChatGPT that does that? No, right? Because he's not in the business of creating software-defined cars. And so those are examples of businesses I like because it involves deep technology, but it involves sort of a multidisciplinary approach. So, you have to not just be good at the AI, but you have to be able to speak the language of the car companies, and you have to be able to implement systems, at global enterprise scale and help the customer reach the promised land. And it's very strategic, right, to these car companies. They know they have to move in the direction of being a software-defined car. And so that's the kind of stuff I've been seeing lately that I get excited about.
But what if somebody says, well, there's only 25 major car companies in the world? How big is the market?
Yeah. And in that case, right, you have to be able to get giant contracts. You have to have individual customers in the hundreds of millions of dollars to make that business work. But you can, right? Like Bosch doesn't have that many customers in the car industry, but they probably do about $50 billion a year selling to the car companies. And so you can, if you become the complete answer to something that company cares about, you can do pretty well. But companies aren't just going to give $100 million to just some bozo, right? They're not going to give you a giant contract unless they think you can really do the job and you're the only guy that can do it. And so you have to have a particular set of skills that people buy into, or it's going to be hard.
If you can, I don't want to really catalyze PTSD in you, but can you discuss the cases where you had a false positive? In other words, that you thought someone was a pattern breaker, but after all, didn't?
Oh, sure. In fact, it's most of the time. And so, my business is very strange. Warren Buffett, I've heard him say, rule number 1, don't lose money. Rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. For me, rule number 1 is don't pass on Airbnb. And so if I'd been wrong about Airbnb, I could only lose 100% my money. But if you're right, you can sometimes make 1,000 times or more. Buffett talks about his margin of safety. What I care about is my margin of asymmetric upside, right? I care about how big could it be in the rare event that it works. So I have this really weird way of coming up with an investment thesis. I'm like, okay, given that it's 80% likely I'm wrong, how big does it need to be if I'm right? And if it can't be big enough, no matter what the odds are, I just can't invest in it because I have to get paid for the risk I take, right? I'm taking crazy high risk. And so I'm like, unlike say Buffett, who never wants to lose money, I'm saying to myself, okay, given that it's 80% likely I'm going to lose money, in the 20% case, how big does it need to get? Which is just a different way of showing up in the world, right? It's a different way of thinking about success. I don't look at risk as the chance of success or failure. I think of risk through an expected value lens. I'm like, okay, in the 20% case, it's right. How big does it need to be a good expected value bet, even though it's risky?
But what if at the moment of making an investment, it's really not an assessment of how big can something be because you don't know what this company is going to pivot to, right? So when you talk about Justin TV, you couldn't do an analysis of how big Justin TV would be. But when Justin TV pivoted to Twitch, then you could, but that wasn't at the point of investment. So what happens how do you factor in the pivots?
Yeah. And so the way I do it is I like to say I don't want to study the total addressable market for the reason that you mentioned. What I believe is that companies that harness inflections define new markets. And I can't size a future market, right? The future hasn't happened yet. So what I need to do is it reminds me in physics, you have potential energy and mechanical energy. What I'm looking for is a future potential market. And I believe that big future potential markets happen from powerful inflections. So the more powerful the inflection is, the more capacity it has to change the future and the more capacity it has to impact the future in a broad way. And so what I do is I take a leap of faith. I say, based upon this inflection, based upon this insight, and based on the founder's authentic match to the future they're pursuing, I think the odds are in my favor. I don't have to know exactly how the dots will connect. I only have to think that the odds are highly probable that the founder will find a way to connect those dots. I love this Jobs saying, right? You can only connect the dots looking backwards. And I think that's what he was getting at, right? Is like you're pursuing opportunities that are ambiguous, but that doesn't mean they're not a risk worth taking. You're betting on the founder's ability to navigate their insight to the right product proposition. To the example that you gave with Twitch, Justin TV is a terrible idea, but they navigated the idea to Twitch, which was a great idea. But the underlying inflections were always there from the very beginning.
Now, what about false negatives where you turn down somebody and they turned out great? Like, what have you learned about why you made false negative decisions?
Yeah, those are to me, those are the biggest errors in my business. Passing on Air Bed and Breakfast at the time was a terrible idea. I've passed on other good ones too. We passed on Pinterest early. We passed on a company called Anaplan, passed on Figma. And so whenever we pass on these, in fact, whether I saw them or not, I keep this database of, I call them 100-bagger startups. I have this list of a little over 100 companies, and I study them. I create a time capsule of what it looked like at the seed round. So I have the seed deck from Pinterest and Dropbox and Airbnb and all these companies. and I look at it and I say to myself, okay, where was the signal? What was the thing that would have told you to say yes? And why did I have a failure of imagination and say no? And with Airbnb, my failure of imagination was I thought, people aren't going to want to stay in a stranger's house. That's crazy. It was around the time the Craigslist killer. I was like, somebody's going to get killed in one of these things, And it was a screwed up meeting. Brian couldn't get the site to work. Sometimes the pitch doesn't go well, but that doesn't mean it's not going to succeed. So I try to go back in time. The other thing that's so hard about this guy is that even the founders misremember how it happened a lot of the time, right? And so when it works, everybody remembers the stuff they knew and the good decisions they made. But a lot of times they know things that weren't so at the time. And so you have to be almost like Joe Colombo detective, right? You do a forensic analysis of what it looked like at the time. And then you got to ask yourself, do any of the frameworks that we use to evaluate these things, would they have been useful here? Would they have caused us to say yes, or are we just breathing our own fumes? Do we believe a bunch of stuff about what's true in the world that just isn't true or doesn't capture the reality of this situation? And so that's what I try to do. I try to go back in time and really understand it. And, there's a lot of things you can do to understand it. You can look at the initial seed pitch deck and you can say, is that what the product ended up being? Or did it end up being something different? How long did it take for them to get to $1 million in revenue, 10 million, 100 million in revenue? What caused that? What kind of business model was it? What was the defensible moat that they created? You could start to kind of look for the signals that would have clued you in that, hey, this is a bet we're taking.
I have not done what you just described in any form as organized or rational or careful as you, but my conclusion, the more I am in Silicon Valley and around tech startups, my conclusion is coming to that the older I get, the less I know. And I could almost make the case that you should just invest in the stupidest things that come across your deck, because that's the ones that's going to succeed. I cannot figure this out. I would have never invested in, as you say, you're going to let a stranger stay in a house. You're going to let a stranger rent your car. You're going to let a stranger ride with you. I would do none of those. And look at that. I'd be 0 for 3 right there.
Yeah, it's tough, right? And it's a humbling game for sure. and the other thing about it, Guy, is like massive success is one Airbnb away. Right? You get one of those every 10 years, you're really good. And so, it's just, it is a humbling game. But like for me, it's just so darn interesting, right? Like we know a whole lot about business now, but 100 years ago, there were no org charts and there wasn't accounting and there wasn't corporate strategy as we know it. There wasn't Michael Porter 5 forces. There wasn't any of this stuff. All that stuff had to be figured out. And I think we're at the beginning of infinity of really understanding startup capitalism. And so I just think a startup capitalist is a different type of capitalist. They don't create value by persistently compounding an advantage like a big company does. They create value by doing something radically different. And that's another way to show up in the world and be valuable. And so I just think there's so much to learn about that. And I think that just like there's a process for building a great company that's a going concern, I think that there are processes and patterns that can be understood about what it takes to create a great startup that changes the future. And there's so little that's known about it. Like, we're having this conversation right now, right? It seems kind of random, right? It seems like trying to predict the weather or something. But, it's to me, that's what makes it so interesting, is it's so hard to figure out that it's worth trying to figure out.
Well, I tell you, Mike, as I get older and older, my strategy is get lucky. But get lucky is not a good strategy.
That's pretty good sometimes.
So I'm going to take you down a rat hole, and you can tell me we don't want to go down this rat hole, but you have the data to know these people better than most people. So, I look at the current Mark Andreessen, the current Elon Musk, the current, Mark Zuckerberg, and I ask myself, what happens to these people? These people started off trying to make the world a better place, democratizing, computing, freedom of information, all that. And now they turn into these MAGA people. And like, you got any thoughts about what happens? Is it age, or is it, when you start being worth $1 billion or more, something just happens in you? Like, what happens to these people?
Well, let's see. So I'm going to tread carefully on the political questions. One thing that I've kind of observed in a lot of these folks is that they tend to be disagreeable. And so when you think about it, a startup is a fundamentally provocative act. It's a disagreement with the present. You're showing up as a founder and you're saying, hey, the way you think the world is, I'm challenging that. Like the way you think the world is, that's not how it's going to be. It's not going to be about taxis anymore. It's going to be about ride sharing. It's not going to be about cars with drivers. It's going to be autonomous vehicles. It's not going to be ICE cars. It's going to be electric vehicles. yes, I am going to start a company that blasts rockets into outer space, even though my competition is the US government and they have an infinite supply of money that they can print. So these people tend to be disagreeable. And by that, I don't just mean being a jerk. I mean, they tend to just be willing to disagree. Justin Kahn, before he started Justin TV, he started a calendaring company, and Google launches Google Calendar, and Justin decides to sell the company on eBay. And I was like, I didn't even know it's possible to sell a company on eBay. He sold this thing for $250,000. So some of the disagreeableness is just the willingness to be unconventional in how you pursue your ideas and your mission. So I think that Elon is naturally disagreeable, and I think it's sort of like there are aspects of disagreeableness that people don't like, but it's kind of like if you make the diamond not have the properties of the diamond, it won't cut glass anymore, right? And so you've got to. I think that most of these people who create these outlier results, they're not normal people, and they're not normal in ways that change the world for the better, and they're not normal in ways that some people may not like. But like Elon said on Saturday Night Live that time, he's like, I blast rockets into outer space and I'm trying to change humanity. Did you expect me to be a normal, chill dude? He's just not going to be. That's not who he is. And so I've kind of learned that these people don't end up fitting neatly into a box that you wish they would fit into. And I imagine that you've known some founders. I mean, you knew Steve Jobs way better than I ever would have. But I imagine there were things that Steve did that probably maybe you wish he didn't do. But it is what it is. It comes with the territory.
Okay. That's one of the great mysteries to me about, why have they taken this attitude? But we'll drop this subject now. So I want to end up with kind of just like a quick series of questions. I'm assuming that many entrepreneurs are going to listen to this podcast, and you're like you're a legitimate, successful VC. They probably, would love to be in front of you. So just some quick questions, very tactical and practical for an entrepreneur. So question number one is, how do people get to a VC? Do they send out 2,000 emails, but how do people get to you?
The best way is to get a referral from somebody that we respect. And people tend to trivialize that discussion. So people tend to say, well, that just means that whoever has the best network wins, and there's going to be certain people who get excluded from being entrepreneurs. But there's a reality, Guy, which is if you're starting a startup, you have to convince people to join your movement. If you're sitting out there in the future by yourself and nobody joins your movement, that future is not going to happen. And so to me, it's not a function of how well connected you are. Getting an intro from someone I respect is a function of your ability to persuade somebody credible that your future matters and that other people are going to want to join you in that future. And so, yeah, something could come over the transom, but how am I supposed to know? How am I supposed to know how good they are? I've got to find some way to validate that their ideas about the future make sense to credible people. It doesn't have to be like Reid Hoffman or Mark Andreessen that makes the intro. It could be you're living in a certain future in synthetic bio, and it's a scientist who's very credible in that area is like, this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And so I just need some signal from the future that validates the idea and the insight. I'd say that that's the key thing. And if your insight is starting to get traction, that should be a solvable problem, right? There should always be somebody credible who embraces the idea, who make the intro. So I'd say that's the primary thing that we look for.
Okay. Next question. What do you want in the pitch? What's the content of the pitch?
Okay. Yeah. So I'll give some super tactical advice on that. So all things being equal, I like to say slide number one, say what you do as if I know literally nothing. So you don't say we're Airbnb, we're a marketplace for unused residential housing space. I don't know what that is. That's jibber jabber jargon. what you want to say is something like, we're Airbnb, we let you rent an extra room in your house. And, so like, here's why that's important. A lot of times you'll get a pitch and you're 10 slides in, I don't know what the startup does still. And that's hard to process, right? And so, and I'm sympathetic to founders on this front because they get advice, they get bad advice. They get advice that says like, well, millennials are a thing, put that slide up front. Marketplaces are a thing, talk about marketplaces. And I'm 10 minutes in, I don't know what you do yet. So slide number 1 is, what do we do? As if I know nothing. Slide number 2 is, what do I know about the future that's not obvious? Is really your chance to convey the insight. Slide number 3 is, anything impressive that's happened so far, objectively. Customers, patents, letters of intent, just some proof that people in the world care about this thing and that they're, joining the movement and signing up. What I find is if the founder can get those 3 things right quickly, 10 minutes in, now the venture capitalist is leaning forward. Now, it's funny, I think we riffed on this earlier. What happens too often is founders get bad advice, and so they create what I like to call a Franken deck. And so what happens is, they'll pitch their advisor, and the advisor wants the best for them. They'll say, hey, VCs love marketplaces because they have network effects. Don't say you rent an extra room in your house. Say we're marketplace for residential real estate because, marketplace, hot, network effect, residential real estate, big. Okay, put that in there. And then the founder say, oh, yeah, you're right. Okay, I'll do that. And then they'll say, the other thing is, this is an appealing service for millennials. So you should have a few slides up front that talk about the importance of millennials and handcrafted experiences, all that stuff. And, you haven't talked about the total available market yet. So you ought to talk about that. You need a few slides on that. You need a few slides on the real estate market, residential.
You
real
need
estate
AI
market.
in there too.
Yeah, today you'd say you need AI. And so then what happens is you go in with this deck of 20 slides, and you pitch somebody, and the VC passes, partly because they don't know what you do. And then they give a reason in their pass note for why they passed. And it's like, oh man, there's another objection. I better have a slide that counters that objection. And so before you know it, you have 30 slides, each of which is designed to anticipate and counter an objection. And what I like to say to founders is, the only people that matter are the people who believe your insight. If a VC doesn't believe your insight, they're not going to invest. There's no way to overcome their objection. They're not going to invest no matter what until it's proven. So what you want to find is the subset of people in this world who believe what you believe. That's true of customers, it's true of investors, true of early employees. Don't waste any ergs of energy on anybody else. And so the problem with the Franken deck is the person who was ready to believe doesn't know what you do, because they got confused by just how convoluted the pitch was. And that person was going to be much more likely to say yes if you just show up and say, we let you rent an extra room in your house. You're going to be able to do this because Facebook Connect lets hosts and guests know who each other are. And, people are used to online reviews and everybody's connected. Millennials want these kind of experiences and all that. That's the conversation you need to have with the person who's prepared to believe. And the person who's not prepared to believe doesn't matter because they're not going to do anything anyway. And so their opinion doesn't matter either. This is the important point. The source of their objection doesn't matter because they're not going to join your movement. Only those who are prepared to join your movement have valid input about your strategy. And so that's really important, I find, is to say, hey, I'm only going to spend time with the people I think are ready to move with me. And I'm going to, bias my feedback collection to what they say.
Well, I got to tell you, Mike, I got to believe that many entrepreneurs listening to this, their heads are basically exploding because,
Maybe.
They've been hammered, and I got to take feedback. I got to, check off all the boxes, and I got to do all this. And basically you're saying you got them in 3 slides. And if you don't get them in 3 slides, you're never going to get them. So just cut your losses, stop wasting time, and go find somebody who does believe the 3 slides.
I think so. And some people may disagree with me here, but when you think about it, it's kind of inspiring. When you realize that great ideas are usually disliked by most at first. By the way, that's true of everything. That's true of Euclidean geometry. It's, Copernicus, when he says the sun is at the center, not the earth, the Pope puts him under house arrest, and says, hey, maybe you ought to change your opinion about that. And so a lot of the great ideas in human history, people, when Einstein proposed the general theory of relativity, they're like, this guy sounds like he's smoking weed. That's one of the most abstract, crazy things I ever heard. And so most great ideas are heretical at first. And so actually, if most people don't like your startup idea, that's a positive sign. If everybody likes your startup idea, it's too incremental. So when you realize that, it's kind of inspiring, right? When you realize, hey, given that most people are going to dislike my idea, who cares about them? They don't matter. They're not creating the future. I am. I and my early believers are going to create the future. They're not going to have a say in it. And so I need to go find who those people are and not waste a single erg of energy on anybody who's not those people. And so what we want to do is we want to find the people who say, oh my gosh, where have you been all my life? This is amazing. I can't wait to, join your call to adventure and go do this with you. That's what you're looking for. And the people who aren't ready to accept your call to adventure, their objections don't matter because they don't apply to your adventure, right? The only objections that matter are the objections from fellow believers because they help you see the future in a more clear way.
Mike, I have more questions, but there's no question I'm going to ask that's going to elicit an answer that is a better way to end this podcast than what you just said. So we're going to...
Okay, I like it.
I think I'm going to, I have this, I call this the casino theory, and I often apply it to surfing. So I'll tell you the casino theory of surfing and podcasting. So sometimes when you go to Las Vegas and you have like $50 in your pocket, you go to a casino and you bet it on blackjack or craps or whatever, and just magically you have $500. So my casino theory is that most people have that $500 and they keep playing until they lose it. But if you're smart and you got lucky, you got $500, you walk out, right? You quit gambling, you walk out with the 500. So the casino theory of surfing is after you caught a great wave, don't try to keep catching waves. You're just going to get disappointed. And the casino theory of podcasting is when you had a great answer like that, you don't ask more questions. You just quit now and you end the podcast because that was a great answer. And all these entrepreneurs around the world, they're putting pieces of their brain back in their head because you just said something that's contrary to what they've heard for the last 2 years. So that's cool. The way to end this podcast, Mike.
All right. Well, I appreciate your taking the time, Guy, and it's great to see you. Congrats on all the success you've had in many types of ways and scenarios, right? I mean, you've kind of been a polymath when it comes to the tech industry. So it's great to see you.
Well, I wish I could say that I caused or really, capitalized on inflections as much as some of the stories that you wrote about. And actually, if I think about it, at the start of my career, I got on the Macintosh inflection. And at the end of my career, I got on the Canva inflection. And I got to tell you, in both cases, I consider myself lucky, not smart. So
you want to pursue opportunities where you only have to be right once because you'll be spectacularly right. The only way to really lose in entrepreneurship is to lose your time pursuing something that you realize in hindsight wasn't worthy of your talent and time. And so we want to go after ideas that are, waves that are worth surfing. Because like you said, if you catch the ideal wave, you did it. You did it.
Thank you, Mike. That was just a remarkable interview. I'm Guy Kawasaki. This is Remarkable People, and all you entrepreneurs who just had all your myths exploded. I empathize with you, but better you hear it now from Guy and Mike than you hear it 2 years from now after all these rejections and disappointments. So That's how to be a remarkable entrepreneur. I want to thank the rest of the Remarkable People team. That's, of course, Madison Neismer, producer, Tessa Neismer, researcher, Louise Magana, Fallon Yates, and Alexis Nishimura. We are the Remarkable People team, and we are hell-bent for leather on a mission to make you remarkable. Until next time, mahalo and aloha.